Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. We're broadcast on Great Plains Television, that's channel 26.1, Sunday morning and Sunday afternoon. We've also got some extra times on Saturday now. I'll let you look at those on my site, The Voice for Liberty, that's wichitaliberty.org. There you'll find Wichita Liberty TV, all the old episodes, show notes for each episode, plus all the other material that I and others produce on nearly a daily basis. But today we've got Carl Peter John co-host in the studio, and our special guest is United States Senator Dr. Tom Coburn of Oklahoma. After graduating from Oklahoma State University, he served as manufacturing manager at a optical industries company. He then went to medical school at the University of Oklahoma and opened a practice in Muskogee. He served in the United States House of Representatives from 1995 to 2001, then returned to his medical practice. He ran for the United States Senate, served from 2005 to 2015, now a fellow at the Manhattan Institute as an advisor to their Project FDA, and last year he joined the Convention of the States Project as senior advisor. He's the author of several books, including most recently Smashing the DC Monopoly, Using Article 5 to Restore Freedom and Stop Runaway Government, and he also wrote the foreword to the book that we've already talked about on Wichita Liberty TV, What Was Really the Matter with the Kansas Tax Plan, The Undoing of a Good Idea. So Dr. Coburn, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV.
Well, thank you. Glad to be with you guys.
So it seems like at the national level, and certainly here within Kansas, the Kansas tax cuts have been controversial, to say the least, and it seems like the constant theme from the left and even from moderates is it was an experiment and that experiment failed.
Well, that's really interesting because in the taxes that have no state income, states that have no state income taxes, they cut taxes and it didn't fail. Mm-hmm. Now, what's the difference? The difference is your legislature didn't take the time to get rid of the waste, fraud, duplication, and stupidness in your state government. I mean, look at Kansas. The only state worse than Kansas is Oklahoma when it comes to education. What do you have, 282 school districts?
Yeah, quite
in Kansas? And it's not about taking away the identity of independent rural school districts. It's about being smart on how you manage them and not having a duplicate things for small school districts and have them do that together. I mean, you can save millions and millions and millions of dollars in education. What happened in Kansas is your legislature didn't stand up to the lobbying forces that wanted more. Mm-hmm. And so the question is should a legislature do what's best for Kansas in the long run or do what's politically expedient?
But in Kansas, we've done something different. We have a state Supreme Court that has basically taken over a large part of the argument on school finance, and that has created an equation that I think is certainly different from Oklahoma, and it's going back and forth. Some states have this elsewhere.
So you need to have a constitutional convention to put limits on the power of the state Supreme Court and make education something that's controlled by the legislature, but mainly controlled by the local school districts, the parents, and the teachers. And when was the last time Kansas had a convention? What was it, 20-some years ago?
No, it's a lot longer than that.
Well, you know, what was not in either of the rough drafts, but came out in the final was that for have a joint resolution, you had to have 2/3.
Yes.
It wasn't ever written anywhere in any of the drafts, except when it got finally published, it was in there. How'd that come about? Somebody wanted it. So we have all this monkey business that's going on. It's time for Oklahoma. We're going to try to push for a state convention, constitutional convention in Oklahoma, because our government is not responsive to the needs of our state, and it takes advantage of the weakness of a politician to be liked. And politicians ought to be about doing the best right thing for their state every time, no matter what happens to their political career. And so, you know, I understand you're smiling, but the fact is you don't have many real courageous leaders.
Well, I'm smiling because I'm a former county commissioner who had some fiscal challenges while in office.
Yeah.
And was defeated really by Republicans, conservatives who wanted more local spending.
Well, so here's the thing. The greatest honor in your life is to do the right thing and then get beat for doing the right thing. Well, it's not the greatest thing is to win election. It's to lose election standing on the right principles.
Well, I sleep well at night with the positions I took for my 8 years as a commissioner. But the bigger question is, in terms of, for both Oklahoma and Kansas, is what's next? Because if we're going to be in a cycle of raising taxes and spending, both states face a whole host of budgetary challenges that if their budgets are out of control, neither state, in terms of looking at all 50 states, we score real high in terms of personal income and economic growth and population growth.
Well, you don't really. Kansas is kind of in an economic stagnation for the last 4 decades. You know, you're dependent on manufacturing and in Wichita, banking and insurance, but mainly your deal's agriculture. And other than when the commodity prices started declining, we had these extremely high commodity prices. What happened? Revenue declined.
Yep.
Yeah, farm income really slashed.
So let's go back to what the real principle is. The least government costs the least, and is often the best. The more government you have costs the most, and is often the worst. So all you have to do is compare yourself to Tennessee or North Carolina. They cut taxes. They don't have state income taxes, right?
Well, North Carolina does. Tennessee does not.
Yeah, but North Carolina markedly cut their income taxes, and guess what? They actually cut spending to do it. And so, do they have a deficit? No. Is their economic growth 2.5 times what Kansas is? Yes. Are their state employees per population about 1/4 or to 1/3 less than what Kansas is? I mean, you have 50% more people working for your state government per 1,000 people than Tennessee. How does that happen?
Well, actually, our problem is local government is
Well,
a bigger
I'm
percentage.
talking just state employees.
But if you combine local and state,
Then you're way out of the mark.
we're one of the worst in the country.
That's right. So you know what you have is this comfortable nature of having a workforce that is full of fat. And here's the other point. I'll make this point in a speech today. Who in Kansas has the power to subpoena and have the people responsible for the budgets under oath talking about their waste? Who permanently studies that issue in the legislature? Nobody.
Yeah, let's talk more about that after we take a commercial break, because I think that's an important point. We'll be back in just a moment. Well, welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with Carl Peter John, our special guest, United States Senator Dr. Tom Coburn.
Retired, okay.
Yes. So you mentioned earlier about who is asking questions and has subpoena power to get these people to talk under oath. You know, there was a move this year by some people to have an inspector general to look at education issues. This office would be like only 3 people. It would be housed in the Kansas Treasurer's office, who is an independent elected office. He doesn't work for the governor or the legislature or anything. Well, people thought that that would be unconstitutional if we had such a thing. But I look at some states have state auditors. I think Missouri has
Oklahoma
a really
has
big
a state
auditor. An independent person who can roam around, poke their nose in whatever they want. We just don't have that in Kansas.
Kansas used to, and
did they?
that was eliminated many, many years ago. But supposedly those functions are contained within the Department of Administration that's underneath the governor.
Yeah, well, we have a Department of Administration in Oklahoma that has 1,200 employees in it, and they do absolutely nothing to hold accountable agencies or create transparency. The number one thing Kansas ought to see is there ought to be a website where every dollar that Kansas spends is up on a website, and every Kansas can see where it's spent. Where's that? You know, if you want to get government efficient, make it transparent. Make it fully transparent and hold people accountable. But unless you give a bicameral, bipartisan committee the power to subpoena and put people under oath, you're never going to undercut the waste, the good old boy networks with the outsiders, the people who benefit. not the people of Kansas, the people that are well connected, who benefit through all this legislative stuff and how all this money is spent. If you will create a transparency, just like you do openthebooks.com, it's the one I passed for the federal government. You can go there and find everything out except somebody's personal Medicare and Social Security and national security issues. But you can find out what every farmer gets in terms of insurance subsidies right now in Kansas.
Mm-hmm. And part of the problem, I think, is like you mentioned in the foreword to the book that there was a grant to Kansas State University and I think some other universities, almost $10 million to study some issues related to cattle and climate change. That's in part of your famous waste book that you did. And you know, I looked up to try to find if I could find our Senator Pat Roberts' fingerprints on that, and I didn't. But that's the type of thing that a typical senator, and I'm going to say Pat Roberts, would point to as an accomplishment, and he would campaign that I brought $10 million to Kansas State University when you pointed out, I think, that the beef industry is a $44 billion industry. Why can't they pay for their own study?
Well, first of all, you don't need to study it. Cows pass gas, period. So what are you going to do? You going to put a collector on the end of every cow?
Well, there's a few folks on the coast, I think, who want that
that's
sort of
fine.
nonsense.
We'll have the cows, and they don't have any, and we won't sell them any meat. How's that? The fact is idiocy. You know, if you take plain old Kansas common sense and you applied it to the problems that you have today in Kansas, it gets solved. But all of a sudden, when you go to Topeka, common sense gets left at home. So why is that? That's because the common nature of man is conflicted when it comes to positions of power. What power does is breed arrogance, and what arrogance does is breed poor judgment. So how is it that Oklahoma, supposedly the reddest state in the country, just passed an $800 million tax without eliminating one bit of waste, stupidity, fraud, duplication, or good old boy insight? And guess who benefited from it the most? Besides the teachers, is the well-connected, the wealthy.
Well, the tax-funded lobbying groups, I would say, had a tremendous benefit from it, whether it's the Oklahoma equivalent of the State School Board Association or
the Kansas Teachers Association, Oklahoma Teachers Association, they all benefit. But the fact is, we didn't do enough for teachers.
Well, we didn't do anything for education in terms of really the classroom.
Right. So until you eliminate all this overhead that can't go to the classroom because everybody's got a little fiefdom in every school district, and in Oklahoma we average about $160,000 per school superintendent, even in the ones that have 200 kids in them. I mean, you just think of it, and we have 550. We have almost double what you have in 77 counties. So, you know, what happens is bureaucracies build and protect themselves. And it takes real courage to challenge those bureaucracies. And you're not popular. If it was about being popular, you know, I would have never gotten elected. I could have tried to be popular. I tried to do the right thing regardless of whether it was swallowed properly or not. And we don't have leadership that's necessary to fix our real problems. And that's what we ought to be concerned with.
Let's take another commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome back again to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. We've got Carl Peter John and Dr. Tom Coburn, former senator, United States Senator from Oklahoma. So, Dr. Coburn, in the foreword to the a book about Kansas taxes, you quoted Frederick Bastiat, who said, "The worst thing that can happen to a good cause, good idea, is not to be skillfully attacked, but to be poorly defended." That sounds like it might be a criticism of our former governor, Sam Brownback, who it's said to be the tax cuts were his signature idea, although I don't know how much of it was really of his and if his idea was really implemented. But I think the governor has admitted that he didn't really do that good of a job getting out the idea that the tax cuts were good.
Well, to me, it's not about individuals, it's about ideas. You know, we have our liberty because people had a great idea. We have our republic because people had a great idea. But through history, we've defended it. Now, we've not lately. That's why we see our government, federal government, and state governments growing. So it's not a direct attack on Senator Brownback, but the fact is if you want to cut taxes, you have to cut government. And anybody that can stand up honestly in Kansas and say, we don't have any fat in our government, I want to have a nice personal debate with them.
Yeah, but can you really cut government? Because it's hard enough to just try and reduce the growth of government below increases in revenue that occur naturally. I mean, if we've got...
It's not hard. Nobody tries to do it. That's the problem. They all say it's hard. I did that all the time for 16 years in Washington. What you have to do is try. And nobody tries because they say it's too hard, or you'll get criticized. I found $400 billion of waste, fraud, duplication every year in Washington. Finally got the Government Accountability Office to put it out. Everybody said, yeah, we can do this. So when I go to cut it and say, won't you sign on? Well, no. That waste has a constituency. Mm-hmm. So the conflict, it's not hard. The conflict is to break the conflict of the career politician who says, I want to be liked and I don't want to have to defend doing something that's right because it'll be unpopular.
With a very narrow, well-organized, well-funded group that receives the benefits from that spending.
Right. So that requires courage. And what our legislators lack is courage and vision to do what's best in the long run for Oklahoma and Kansas, not what's politically expedient. Martin Luther King said this, and this is a paraphrase, it's my paraphrase. He said, cowardice asks the question, is it expedient? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And our legislators are asking the wrong question. They want to be popular and expedient.
And be reelected.
They don't care whether they're right or not. And that's a very big danger to any republic. Because four things that allow a republic to survive: limited government, rule of law, economic freedom, and virtuous public. Well, I would tell you we're failing on all four of those. And so, it may not matter what Kansas do because we may not be around that much longer.
Well, then you're talking about national as well as...
Absolutely. I'm talking about state as well.
But if we're failing at all four levels... you wrote a book about 6 years ago outlining the debt bomb. In fact, that was the title, and we haven't gotten there yet. In terms of, we haven't had that type of explosion. There's a lot of historic evidence that that this has regularly happened in the past in other countries. Yeah. When do we reach the tipping point?
With our total debt today, no country has ever survived where we are. As far as the total debt in our country, not just government debt, but personal debt, corporate debt, county debt, city debt, student loan debt, no country has ever survived that. So everything will continue like it does till it doesn't. But let me just tell you a little inside what's happening. Why has Trump backed down a little bit on the Chinese, on trade? Because the Chinese own $1.8 trillion of our debt. And Xi sent a signal. Well, we'll just dump it. Mm-hmm. What do you think happens to us? What do you think happens to us?
Interest rates would go straight skyrocketing.
Right, and so what would that happen? That'd add another $800 billion a year in interest costs. And we're going to have another $1 trillion.
On the books as opposed to...
Above what we have now. We're already going to have another $1 trillion deficit. This CBO says that for the next 10 years, we're going to have $1 trillion deficits. Yeah. So, it's not fair to the millennials. What we're talking about is stealing from the future from your kids. And the average millennial today, for the next 50 years, is going to have to come up with $33,000 per year in either income taxes, decreased standard of living, or inflation through printing money at the Federal Reserve. There's no way around that other than that. So if that's the gift we as Kansans and Oklahomans and Americans want to leave to our kids, just keep doing what we're doing. That's why Convention of States is so important. That's why Kansas has to pass it. Because the only way we can actually fix our country is with a tool that's big enough to fix it.
When we come back, we'll ask Dr. Tom Coburn to explain a little bit about the Convention of States. And I think term limits is going to be one of the most important things. We'll be back in just a moment. Well, welcome back again to Wichita Liberty TV. Bob Weeks here, co-host Carl Peter John, and United States Senator, retired Dr. Tom Coburn of Oklahoma. So, regarding the Convention of the States, something we've talked about a number of times in our show before, one of the things that I think would be proposed in this would be term limits of legislators. What's interesting is legislative bodies have no problem putting term limits on their chief executives. Most state governors, I think, have term limits, and of course the President of the United States does, but they don't like term limits on themselves, do they?
Well, that's because they all have fairyland wishes of being in one of those positions that would be term limited. Look, term limits to me is the least important thing, because term limits works when you believe in it for yourself. Because it changes your perspective and how you legislate. I'm only going to be here this long. I want to really work hard and get done what I can get done in this period of time. I don't think it's the most important. I agree that long-term serving people get influenced and lose connection, but they're losing connection with the Constitution. I mean, there was a great example this past week where we had somebody who sponsored the balanced budget amendment in the House, but the irony was they voted for the the terrible bill that just went through. So you can't be both. You either have to believe we need to live within our means or not. And you can't play this charade as, oh, I'm for a balanced budget amendment, and then over here voting to spend money we don't have on things we don't absolutely need. I mean, we increased Pentagon spending, what, $200 billion in that. I can find you $200 billion of waste in the Pentagon right now. But nobody wants to look at that, because everybody has a defense contractor in their state.
Right. Every congressional district, probably.
Yeah.
You know, in preparation for this, I watched last May, you were on Washington Journal on C-SPAN talking about the Article 5 book, and boy, people really called in, and, you know, they think that there needs to be more government in many cases, more taxes. Government needs to do more things for us. But that's, I think, really the wrong way. I mean, in your waste book, you have a lot of examples of specific areas of waste, but take, let's say, for example, the Kansas school system. People talk about, well, there's waste, the administrators make too much, but a lot of the waste is just baked in the fact that no one's really has market accountability in schools like a grocery store does, for example.
There's no transparency. Well, let people walk with their, in Oklahoma, it's about almost $12,000 per kid per year.
Here in Wichita, it's about 14.
Okay, so if my grandkids go to a private classical Socratic teaching method school.
We have a couple of those in Wichita.
It costs $9,000 a year. The education's fabulous. It costs $3,000 less than what we're spending in the state. And my question I ask, why can't every kid have this? What is it? It's the layers of bureaucracy that bureaucracies build to make sure they have a job in the future to create themselves necessary. And it's called marbled fat. You can't, there's not just a big hunk of waste out there. What you have to do is you have to do the hard work of digging down. How does Wichita schools compare to a school district of the same size in Tennessee? Which one's more efficient? And how come they're more efficient? What is it? That's why you need an oversight committee that's permanent, that has 4 to 8 staff, that all they do is dig. Investigative journalists is what I would hire. Dig and find out, and then have subpoena powered to get the real information. And then the other thing Kansas has to do is you have to pass a transparency law so the Kansas can see where the money's spent.
Well, I'd love school-based budgeting that you could all over the state, so each of the schools you'd be able to see it. Because I frankly believe we have diseconomies of scale. The larger the school district, the less efficient they turn out to be in many ways.
They are.
Let me ask you, going back to the Article of States, there's one of the problems trying to get it through Kansas is there's some conservatives who say, hey, we're concerned about a runaway convention.
It's just a joke. It's a way to raise money, one. Number two is there's no way that can happen. And if you read the history, if you read my book, Smashing the DC, I go through all that. All the legal precedents were set before we ever had the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention came out of an amendments convention. It also came out of, the Bill of Rights came out of amendments convention. So we know how that happens. Can anything get passed in the Kansas legislature that's outside the scope of whatever's being considered? No. Somebody raises their hand and said, I raise a point of order that that's not germane. Well, the same thing will happen in this. There may be crazy people that want to do stuff like socialize everything, but first of all, it's got to be within the applications. There's no movement in those applications for those kind of things. So even if I'm wrong and it came out of the Congress will never forward anything like that, because it'll get enjoined by the Supreme Court saying you have to be within the scope of what your application was. That's why every application has to be the same. And we're the only group out there making it. Balanced budget is great, except you know what? You can't fix our country with a balanced budget amendment because everybody that has one cheats. And so will the federal government.
Well, many states have had balanced budget amendments.
Oklahoma cheats every year. What they do is just throw if they're short $500 million, they do a $500 million highway bond and take that money, and we're going to build highways over the next few years and spend that money.
That's what we've done.
The only tool for America, if you want to solve the problems and create a future for our kids, you have to go to conventionofstates.com, read about it, learn about it. All the scare tactics of the hard right down in southeast Kansas, where they've done all this stuff to say we're going to lose our gun rights, is just baloney. And they know it's baloney. They're cowards because they don't have the courage to fix what's wrong with our country. And our country wasn't built on that.
I'm afraid we'll have to leave it at that, Dr. Tom Coburn. We'll put that in the show notes, the conventionofstates.com,
Okay.
and it's a good thing, I think, to look at. So thanks very much for being our
Glad
guest
to be
today.
with you guys.
Thank you, Carl. Appreciate it.
No.
And thank you to you, the listener. We'll see you again next week.